Welcome to the Musings of Jessica Marie. Revolutions take a lot of courage, discipline, and faith to pull off. Advocating for change in a society that has always deemed a group of people as less than requires sacrifice and preservation, even as leaders are lost and movements rise and fall. One of the most impactful leaders and revolutionaries of modern Black American history was lost on February 21st, 1965 to senseless violence. Join me as we shine a historical spotlight on Malcolm X. Malcolm was born on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska to his parents Louise and Earl Little, who taught him about self-reliance and Black pride from an early age. They were believers of Marcus Garvey and actively participated in movements for the advancement of Black people, but due to their activism, the family received numerous threats from the Ku Klux Klan and were forced to relocate many times. They spent a brief time in Milwaukee before landing in Michigan in 1926, but the threats and the harassment continued for the family. Malcolm lost his father at the age of 6 from an apparent attack by a white supremacist group called the Black Legion. While his death was officially ruled a streetcar accident, Louise and other members of the community saw that excuse as simply a smokescreen to protect the true perpetrators who wrongfully killed a man who was speaking out against the injustices he witnessed. Since one of Earl's life insurance policies refused to pay after claiming he committed suicide, the family was forced to rent out part of the garden and hunt game to make ends meet. In 1938, Louise suffered from a nervous breakdown after being left pregnant by a man she was dating and was committed to Kalamazoo State Hospital in Michigan. Her children were split up and sent to foster homes. After losing both of his parents, Malcolm had to fend for himself. Despite excelling in middle school, he dropped out of high school in 1941 after a white teacher discouraged him from trying to practice law. This early pushback paved the way for his later feelings that a career-oriented Black man would never have a place in the dominant society, regardless of his talent, intelligence, or skill. Malcolm moved to Harlem in 1943 and worked on the New Haven Railroad. During this time, he did what he had to do to survive, oftentimes turning to drug dealing, gambling, burglary, and even robbery. He was summoned for the World War II draft, but pretended to be mentally ill to avoid getting sent overseas. In 1946, Malcolm was arrested and charged with theft and breaking and entering after committing a series of burglaries that targeted wealthy white families in Boston. While in prison serving his 8 to 10 year sentence, he met John Bembry, a self-educated man who showed him how to command respect with words. John's fundamental impact helped Malcolm develop his immense appetite for reading. His siblings wrote to him about the Nation of Islam, a relatively new religious movement that taught Black self-reliance and advertised a return to Africa where everyone in the African diaspora could be free from white influence and domination. He was hesitant to accept the teachings at first, but after a visit from one of his brothers, he reflected on his past situations and relationships and over time became more receptive. In 1948, he wrote to Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, who encouraged him to renounce his past, humbly bow in prayer to God, and promise to never engage in destructive behavior again. After pushing past his initial inner struggle, he became a full-fledged member and maintained regular correspondence with Elijah. In 1950, he took on the moniker Malcolm X to symbolize the true African family name he was robbed of ever knowing. Like other prominent Black leaders of the time, the FBI opened a file on Malcolm that same year after he wrote a letter to President Harry Truman opposing the Korean War and declaring himself a communist. After being released from prison in August 1952, he became extremely active in growing the nation's temples in Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia, and Harlem. Due to his increased stature of influence and leadership, the FBI officially began surveillance on him in 1953. In 1955, Betty Sanders began regularly attending Malcolm's lectures and joined the Nation of Islam in 1956. Solo dates were discouraged in the teachings so the couple courted during social events with multiple people around. Malcolm proposed in January 1958, and the pair were married just 2 days later. They went on to have 6 daughters together. Malcolm X stepped into the American spotlight in 1957 after advocating for Hinton Johnson, a Nation of Islam member who was unjustly beaten by 2 New York City police officers. A large crowd gathered outside the police station as Malcolm attempted to arrange treatment and bail for Hinton and the other Muslims involved in the altercation. Once the situation reached a stalemate, Malcolm stepped outside to give a hand signal to the crowd, prompting all the Nation members to leave. The New York City Police Department took notice of his command and immediately grew weary of Malcolm's influence. Within a month, they began keeping him under surveillance and even assigned undercover officers to infiltrate the Nation of Islam. The civil rights movement was gaining traction concurrently when Malcolm X rose to prominence. The differing fundamental teachings caused strife amongst the two movements. On one hand, the NAACP and other civil rights organizations viewed the Nation of Islam as a group of irresponsible extremists, but Malcolm had been equally critical that civil rights leaders didn't go far enough with their demands. He thought those organizations were being propped up by the exact people who were inflicting harm on his community. Malcolm X advocated for a complete separation from the dominant society and strived to create a separate country for Black people in America. He rejected the strategy of nonviolence that was customary to the civil rights movement and instead argued that Black people should defend themselves by any means necessary. His views appealed to many who were tired of being told to wait for freedom, justice, equality, and respect. On April 27, 1962, more than 70 unprovoked LAPD officers attacked and raided Temple No. 27, killing 7 people and injuring many more. Malcolm wanted revenge against the police for the unnecessary violence and destruction of the mosque, but was blocked by Elijah Muhammad. This was one of many key turning points that caused Malcolm to officially distance from the nation on March 8, 1964. Afterwards, Malcolm X founded Muslim Mosque Inc. and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, converted to Sunni Islam, and even completed the pilgrimage to Mecca. Much of his time was spent speaking to a wide variety of audiences, and he was one of the most sought-after speakers on college campuses. Despite breaking away from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm and his family started receiving death threats throughout 1964 for speaking out against Elijah Muhammad. Not only was Malcolm's car bombed and house set on fire, but his wife and the FBI received tips that he'd be killed soon. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm was murdered while trying to give a speech in Manhattan's Audubon Ballroom. Someone caused a commotion that allowed 3 men to rush forward and shoot him with a sawed-off shotgun and semi-automatic handguns. He was pronounced dead from the numerous gunshot wounds. Thomas Hagen, along with 2 other Nation of Islam members, were arrested, charged, and convicted of his murder. After COINTELPRO came to light in the 1970s, it suggested that John Ali, National Secretary of the Nation of Islam, was actually a former FBI agent. He opposed Malcolm and exacerbated tensions between him and Elijah Muhammad. It was also found that John had a meeting with Thomas Hagen the night before the assassination, a coincidence that simply cannot be ignored. Despite being portrayed as an angry Black Muslim extremist for much of his adult life, he ultimately advocated for the betterment of his community and helped raise the self-esteem of Black Americans. He was killed for being one of the greatest and most influential leaders of change, and his impact continues to inspire people today. If you enjoyed this episode, let me know by giving this video a thumbs up, leaving a comment, and subscribing to my channel. I'll see you in the next episode. Signed, Jessica Marie.